Yes, you can. Hello, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. I'm Aya Soma, and I'm here with two venerables, Bhante Sudaso, who you all hopefully know by now, and Venerable Taladamika, who has joined us today from Temple Forest Monastery and is now wandering a little bit. So we will be answering, as usual, to any questions that you might have, both the live in-person audience and the just live audience without the in-person part. So welcome to Rick and Putrika, Dinko, Kumu, Gita, Aurora, Patricia, Anita, Robin, Deborah, Jayanta, good to see you, Joseph. All right, lots of good friends. So Rick has already a question, I think. And it says, I'm at peace with how others celebrate the holidays. However, I prefer not to participate in the greed and commercialization. It's a difficult word for ESL people. Commercialization of Christmas. I prefer to practice generosity throughout the year. When practicing the Brahmaviharas, how do we skillfully interact with family members who react with hostility when we ask not to be included in expected Christmas gift giving? I'm going to pass this on to Venerable Paladam.
Yeah. I'm not a good example. I'm a Grinch when it comes to Christmas time.
All right, so maybe I'll pass it on to Bhante Sudasan.
Well, so actually I would say then to look at your own resistance. So recognize that this is an opportunity to practice generosity. So of course it's good to practice generosity throughout the year. But personally, I think it's really lovely that there is designated gift-giving occasions, because for many people, this is actually the only time that they practice generosity. So if we didn't have designated gift-giving times, they probably wouldn't practice generosity at all. So personally, I think that culturally mandated gift-giving is still much better than no gift-giving at all. So of course, it's much nicer if people spontaneously practice generosity without needing cultural pressure. But honestly, I think, as the Buddha said, giving is good. It's good to give. So I would praise and encourage gift giving even when it's under that coercive kind of setting. It's still wholesome. It's still meritorious. And it still builds up the mind and attitude of generosity. So you can be an exemplar of generosity on that occasion. So yeah, I would encourage you to question your own refusal to participate, and rather see it as an opportunity to praise the value of generosity and to encourage it in others as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Bhante. And Deborah asks a question. Could you speak on the benefits of Sangha? How are these benefits realized in your practice? Well, the Buddha says Kalyanamita is the entire path. But sometimes actually when we're living in community, the hardest part, people think that it's celibacy, and it's usually like, how can you be celibate? I'm like, well, actually, one of the biggest issues for me is not celibacy, but actually living in community is on the top list. It's quite terrible, actually. I mean, I used to live, most of my life, I lived either by myself or with strictly selected number of people, and the former was always more pleasant than the latter. So now that actually the number has expanded, it can be quite challenging, but it's so interesting because I've never been happier too. So in the moment, actually, a lot of times there's a difficulty, but then it's a cumulative effect. It's kind of like meditation in a way. As you're doing it, sometimes it can be painful. You're kind of like, oh, wow, my mind is really restless and I'm not really meditating. I'm just like returning to the breath over and over again. But then you finish the session of meditation and your mind is peaceful and more clear and more just peaceful and relaxing. And it's the same actually living in community. It's kind of painful. We all rub each other in the wrong way sometimes. You also, it's like basically being married to a lot of people that you have not chosen and that you can't really divorce from. There's a lot of interesting similarities actually to daily life. They're actually amplified in a way. But yeah, everybody here is committed. I love you, everyone. Sorry. Of course, it's not about anyone present. But yeah, actually, everybody has the aspiration for awakening. Everybody is here for the same sort of purpose, shared goal. So that's the biggest benefit, is actually having people who are committed to precepts, are committed to developing sila, samadhi, and panya. And so you're not a weirdo, you know? I mean, you're a weirdo amongst many other weirdos. So there is that, that sort of sense of anukampa, of trembling together, that then creates an interesting support. So yeah, as much as I hate living in community, I find it extremely beneficial and supportive. So ironically, my hatred is sort of diminishing and diminishing. So yeah, it's a counterintuitive practice, but we have to have faith in Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha in order to take it as a working hypothesis and keep a momentum and really give ourselves the opportunity to reap the fruits and the benefits of the practice. So I hope that answered your question. Maybe the other venerables want to share their ideas on or their experience.
I got nothing. You handled that quite well.
All right. No?
I think you nailed it.
Okay. Oh, good to see you, Mary. I hope your health is better. All right, welcome. And Robin says, Venerables, could you explain what taking refuge means? When should someone do this? Venerable Padamika, you've taken refuge. So what do you think?
I defer to the...
All right.
I have a feeling we're gonna have a hard time getting words out of him this evening.
Give me a juicy question. I might say
okay,
something.
you can pick the next one.
Maybe if you see a question that you want to answer, let us know.
Okay, great.
Okay. So taking refuge, well, ultimately it means recognizing that the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha are the most important things for you in the entire world. That's what taking refuge means. It means that you respect the Buddha as being the highest ideal of any sentient being. The Buddha is representing what every sentient being should strive to be like. And you recognize the Dhamma as being the most important body of knowledge, the most important guidelines for life that one could possibly live by. And one recognizes the Sangha as being the ideal group of people to live with, as is reflected in Ayasoma's statements just now. So the Sangha represents the people who are committed to trying to be like the Buddha, people who are committed to living out the Dhamma. I remember a few weeks ago, I was talking to a person and they were telling me, they're like, yeah, I have a lot of faith in the Buddha and a lot of faith in the Dhamma, but I'm not so sure about the Sangha. And I was like, well, yeah, I can see that. If you think of the Sangha as being those particular individuals, like that grumpy guy who irritates you or that delusional person who has weird beliefs, if that's what you think the Sangha is, if you think Sangha means grumpiness and irritability, then yeah, of course you're going to not have much faith in it. You won't want to take refuge in it. But that's not what Sangha means. Sangha is the community of people who are deeply committed to trying to embody the Buddha Dhamma and deeply committed to supporting each other in embodying the Buddha Dhamma. So that's what taking refuge in Sangha means. It means recognizing the value of being in this mutually supportive relationship with other dedicated practitioners. And it also particularly means the monastic community. So forging a supportive relationship with monastic communities as well, whether as a layperson or as a monastic yourself. So taking refuge, again, it means placing Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha above everything else. You might still do other things with your life and have other things that you consider important, but you take these three as being the most important. When should you do it? Every morning, right after you wake up. So here at the monastery, it's part of our morning chanting every day, is taking the 3 refuges. And if you're not living in a monastery, then just do it in the morning, right after you wake up, before you do your morning meditation. Take the 3 refuges and 5 precepts. I think that covers it.
I have a bit to add to this. So taking refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, I would say, is undertaking this faith in the idea of enlightenment, that the Buddha was somebody who, through great efforts, was able to attain this state of so-called awakening, or unbinding is a translation I tend to prefer. And what he had woken up to and realized was the Dhamma. And the Sangha is just a group of individuals who, seeking out training, came to the Buddha and were able to then realize this Dhamma. So for me, fundamentally, the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, that it's surrounded and intertwined in this idea of that liberation is possible. Okay.
Wonderful, thank you, Bante. And Anita asks, how does one start to learn Pali? Would you also like to take that? You started to learn Pali too?
I stopped. One question I would encourage you to ponder about is, why do you want to learn Pali in the first place? Bhikkhu Bodhi has made quite a substantial effort in translating the Nikayas, except for the Dika Nikaya. He skipped out on that one, but and the translations are quite good. I was talking with Jens about this earlier. I mean, it gives you a good enough idea of what the Buddha was trying to teach. However, when you go about translating things into English, you can lose a lot of the nuance and meaning that you don't get when you're quite adept at Pali. So your question is, how do you learn Pali? There's a South African monk in Sri Lanka who I kind of learned his method, and he started with this book by Venerable Buddhadatta. And with that book, he would use a spaced repetition program called Anki. So you would kind of build your vocabulary using this program, because vocabulary is quite important with Pali, because you don't have the kind of environment to learn like you would a living language like Spanish or Italian or whatever, where you can use that language. You don't have that. So you're really kind of jamming vocabulary and sentence structure into your head, and it can, in my mind, really elongate the learning process. So pick a grammar book, go through the lessons, develop a routine where you're learning vocabulary. Try to read the Pali. Chanting also helps. Chanting Pali. There are a variety of ways you can tackle this beast. But when you do learn it, and then you get to the point where you can start translating things, you start seeing, oh, this word doesn't just mean suffering, or doesn't just mean heedless, or whatever. You can get different flavors from the Pali language. That's my 2 cents.
Great, thank you, Venerable, for the insights. And Anita also asks, is there any sutta that talks of how one can turn to Dhammas, and the Dhamma is right where the opposite of it is happening, and one just needs to turn to it? I mean, I think the entire Pali Canon of the suttas are pretty much about, realizing our inversions of minds, of how we got it all wrong. I still remember when I started reading the suttas that a lot of them start with, the uninstructed worldling. The uninstructed worldling does this and that. But when I had read the uninstructed worldling first, I immediately did not identify with the uninstructed worldling until there was actually the definition of what the uninstructed worldling was doing. And then right after there's the description of how the noble disciple, on the other hand, deals with all the different vicissitudes of life. And I was like, okay, that's very much more inspiring, but also how interesting that I am the uninstructed worldling. It was so offensive, actually. I'm feeling so like all my pride disintegrated in that moment. But at the same time, also realizing actually that there was a different way, perhaps, to relate to things, or to relate to suffering, instead of thinking that the cause of suffering is all external and that it's quite random and there's not really much that you can do about it except for feeling sorry for yourself or getting angry. There's actually a way out of suffering. So all the suttas are pretty much, as I see it, about this, but maybe Bhante Sutta also has.
No, I think that's spot on. Really the best way to develop right view is just to read through the suttas cover to cover, over and over. And it just starts to sink in. It starts to gradually melt away our wrong views. And there's a few things that become really clear when you read through the suttas over and over again. One thing that becomes clear is how often the Buddha talks about compassion. Like, I don't know how this keeps getting skipped over in the Western rhetoric about Theravada, because it's all through the suttas. It's everywhere you look. He also talks about samadhi all the time. He talks about jhana all the time. Again, when you read the suttas, it starts to really sink in how much importance the Buddha put on things like compassion and samadhi, which for some reason don't get as much airtime as the juicier things like vipassana. He talks about vipassana a lot too, by the way. But compassion and samadhi are just all over the place. Another thing that comes through really, very clearly in the suttas is this. You get this sense, like, I almost feel when reading the Buddha's words, like he has this attitude of this kind of like mildly amused parent, where like he keeps trying to teach the kids and the kids keep not getting it, and the Buddha's like, okay, little ones, let me try again, and they still don't get it. And he's like, all right, let's try it a different way, and they still don't get it. And then finally some of them get it. And he's like, all right, score. Let's move on to the next group. So that's another thing which you start to feel as you read through the suttas, is you start to feel this loving, gentle persistence of the Buddha. And sometimes that did take the form of some rather harsh condemnations of people's defilements. But you have this sense like the Buddha is not giving up on us. Rather, it's we who keep giving up on the Dhamma. But the Buddha didn't give up on us.
Thank you, Bhante. And Sudsu says, what is the best way to develop loving kindness? Is it during daily activity, or is it with formal sitting practice? Anybody wants to volunteer for this question?
Both. I mean, there's a lot of talk about cultivating the Brahma Viharas and radiating it in all directions, and that is generally talked about in a formal meditative practice. But there are there's a sutta, I think it was the Kosinga Sutta. It was the monks were quarreling at Kosinga, and then he instructs the monks, and one of the things he says is a monastic practices verbal, physical, and mental actions of loving kindness, both in public and in private, towards his virtuous spiritual companions. So you're not just cultivating metta while you're on the sitting cushion, but also, letting somebody go in front of you while you're driving, or whatever simple acts that you can cultivate.
Thank you, Venerable. Yes, I will also share. I just came back from a couple of days of Tudong with Ayasada and Tansudam, Thai Bhikkhu, and we were walking about like 25 miles a day, which was brutal, but a good type of brutal. And also Tansudam is very interesting. He's a remarkable monk. But anyway, we were walking in kind of like basically the entire samsara of the United States. It felt, every single type of neighborhood, every single type of from the city to the suburbs to the highway to the sort of more rural areas. And there are so many different beings that you would encounter along the way, and just smiling to everyone and saying hello. It's so incredible how something so ordinary could have such an incredible impact on people's daily lives. So that was an incredible teaching of loving kindness in my mind, and also how by practicing metta, we also share metta. So you would see people, going through a lot of distress, actually, with a really heavy mind and body. Then they would lift up their gaze and see us monastics, and we would go like, "Good morning, may you be happy." And immediately they would go from like this to like, like so visible, so physical. And you would see also yourself doing that at the same time internally. So it was a beautiful way to open the heart and also open people's heart at the same time. And that is accessible to every single person. You don't have to sit on a cushion for hours and hours. Actually, that was, I think, the most powerful and effective way of doing metta that I've experienced since I started. Since I started practicing Buddhism, actually. Did you have any other thoughts on the matter?
Yeah, again, I think that covers it. Again, we don't draw a distinction between internal and external. And I just gave 3 talks in a row on the Brahma Viharas, and this is one point I was making over and over again, is that Brahma Viharas are both an internal development, but also an external activity. And there's ultimately no line between the two. They're inseparable.
Yeah, and Kumo says, Venerable, why is meditation while lying down not giving prominence, even though the Buddha recommended 4 postures in the Satipatthana? Is it not good for breath meditation as the spine needs to be erect?
Realistically, it's just because it's so much easier to fall asleep when you're lying down, or the mind tends to become very, very dull and unclear. But yeah, of course, it's good to try to meditate while lying down. Just don't make it your primary posture. Because for most people, the best meditation posture is sitting and walking. For most people, that's what they get the best results from. Standing meditation also can be quite effective for many people. But reclining meditation for most people is not very good because the mind tends to become very dull and unclear. But it's worth experimenting with. Over the years, I have met a handful of monks who had good results from reclining meditation, but very, very few. Actually, I can only think of a couple off the top of my head. On the other hand, I know many monks who tried reclining meditation and found it was terrible, found that their samadhi became extremely weak. I know one monk he was actually famous for his great metta. He was well known for having this really incredible loving kindness. And I was living with him for a while, and I noticed that over the course of several months, he was just getting grumpier and grumpier every day. And then finally one day, he actually apologized. He was like, he admitted that he had to finally come face to face with the facts that reclining meditation was not working. And that all his metta was going right out the window. And he needed to give up on meditating in a reclining position. So again, for most people, it's just not a very effective position. But it's still worth every once in a rare while experiment with it. Do some reclining practice, see what it feels like. But don't make it your primary posture.
Thank you, Brampton. And Dinko says, do you have any advice on restraining our senses more effectively in everyday lay life?
It's,
Want to take that? Brampton?
I'll pass.
Well,
Thanks, Selma.
well, as the Buddha mentions, actually, if we focus too much on the pleasantness, for example, of things, we feel a pleasant feeling, we feel it attached. When we feel an unpleasant feeling, we feel it attached. When we feel an neither pleasant nor unpleasant feeling, we feel it attached. And that's because we're essentially covered with glue. So we're like, yeah, every kind of sensual pleasures just get at me. But if we actually are a little bit more skillful in how we're relating to things, so if we, know that, for example, we're about to have a meal, instead of just going there cluelessly and going like, "Ooh, yeah, ice cream. Ooh, yuck, fish. Ooh," whatever it is that we like and dislike. Instead, we relate to it in a different way. So we do a bit of a preparatory work. And so if we tend to notice at all the pleasantness, for example, of an experience, well, actually, we can start looking at the unpleasantness of that same experience intentionally. Not to be a Debbie Downer, we don't want to become depressed out of this, but rather having a full experience. As I like to say, the example of ice cream. We tend to focus whenever we have ice cream, if we like ice cream, we tend to focus very much on the creamy part. But right now that it's cold in New Jersey, apart from Venerable Paladamika, we're all covered up because it's cold. Because Venerable is coming from New Hampshire where it was colder, so I think he's finding it more warm. But right now the part of the ice part of the ice cream would be an unpleasant feeling, right? But we focus so much on the creaminess that then we keep on getting more, fueling the attachment towards the ice cream. But if we focus on that, then we're like, oh, actually, this is really not that pleasant after all, or at least it's less pleasant than I thought it was. And so whether we become a little bit less, less fervor in the mind, of less wanting, craving of the ice cream, less going, oh, tomorrow there's no ice cream, I don't know how I'm going to survive. Life is as difficult as it is. And if you remove even that sensual pleasure, what am I going to do, right? It would be very dramatic. But instead, we have a full experience and we're like, okay, well, if there's ice cream, okay, good. If there's not, it's fine too. And then, if we are, on the other hand, only seeing the awfulness of samsara, well, the Buddha recommends highly to actually develop our mind with the Brahma Viharas. So, in particular with loving kindness. So you can search all the instructions that Bhante Sudaso has given in the past days and cultivate the mind in that way. So the one good thing about dealing with an aversive mind is actually the fact that at least you're not enthralled with samsara. So, but it's very blameful. The Buddha says it's the most blameful, but it's the easiest to overcome. Greed is the least blameful, but the most difficult to overcome. So at least you can go, okay, well, at least I've done some progress in the path. So I'm not that obsessed with sensual pleasures, but then it's good to cultivate loving kindness. Yeah, and neither pleasant or unpleasant. Well, yeah, let's start paying attention to pretty much most of our experience is kind of bland, and we tend to overlook it and always chasing for something exciting. So the more we pay attention to it, and that's a lot of the work that we actually do in meditation practice, the more we create conditions for wisdom to arise in the mind. So all of this creates restraint. we let go and we become more wise.
I had a question about study, Venerables. So there are so many things you can study with the Dhamma. It's sort of overwhelming. There's 84,000 suttas, then there's the YouTube channels, and there's the commentaries on the commentaries. So how should one approach study in the path? How do you choose what to study versus what not to study?
Start with the suttas. That's the most important. So once you've read through all of the Pali Suttas cover to cover, at least once, then you can decide what you want to do next. Whether you want to read contemporary teachers, or if you want to read Mahayana texts, or if you want to read whatever. But having that solid foundation in having read the Sutta Pitaka, it's invaluable. It gives you a really clear understanding of what the Buddha was trying to communicate, and of what really is fundamental to the spiritual life, what's fundamental to the path of awakening. And that also will help to calibrate your BS meter, because let's face the facts, there's a lot of BS out there. You pick any Dhamma book off the shelf and odds are there's some BS in there. No matter how respectable the teacher who produced the book is, there's probably some misinformation in that book. And if you haven't read the suttas, it's hard to tell what's what. But if you have read the suttas, it's much easier. It's much easier to figure out what's in line with Dhamma and what's not. So start with reading through the suttas, again, all of them, cover to cover. I usually recommend starting with the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle length discourses. Then you can read other things if you want to. I recommend having a relatively balanced day where you spend a certain amount of time studying, a certain amount of time meditating, a certain amount of time doing some chanting, a certain amount of time studying Pali, a certain amount of time doing whatever needs to be done. Like I don't recommend just reading, doing nothing but reading for 18 hours a day. Though I do recall at one point I was so enthusiastic about the suttas that I actually would just read for hours and hours every day. But I was still doing some meditation and other things. But I was really, really loving the suttas, and I just couldn't stop. And that's okay, as long as you're still doing the other parts of your practice. Most people, in my experience, their problem is not overstudying. It's actually the opposite. It's that they spend a lot of time meditating but without really knowing what they're doing or where they're going. Which it's a bit like getting in a car and driving around in circles. Feels like you're going somewhere, but you're not really going anywhere at all. So it's the same. You can meditate all day long, but if you don't know the Dhamma, then good luck. Ajahn Chah said it's like a chicken. A chicken sits for hours and hours and hours every day, but they never get enlightened. And the reason for that is because chickens don't know the Dhamma. So you can meditate for hours and hours every day, but if you don't know the Dhamma, then you're just like a chicken. So good luck.
Thank you, Bante. And you had any ideas to share as well?
I mean, that's pretty much it. I started in the Mahasi Sayadaw tradition, and so I was really more interested in the commentaries. But it wasn't years later, and so until I met my Upajjhaya, actually, where I started studying the suttas. And I mean, if you are interested in Buddhism, if you're interested in what the Buddha taught, that is our best guess. And it's it's not a bad guess. It's I after reading Venerable Nalio's comparative studies work, it seems to be rather reliable. What they transmitted. So go there, as the Venerable said, make yourself, soak your mind in that. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Venerable.
And it looks like.
Oh, sorry. Our other resident has another question.
Yeah, so pleasant emotions can sometimes make very pleasant body sensations, and then we can have sensual desire for those body sensations, or sometimes we just have pleasant body sensations and have desire for the body sensations. What's a good attitude to take toward this kind of sensual desire for body sensations?
What's a good attitude to take for pleasant in the body? Oof. I mean, the answers I have are very simple.
Well, then give a
That's good.
simple answer. Simple answers
simple
are
is
good.
I mean, they're very, yeah, they're impermanent.
Exactly so.
So,
Yeah, just see it as impermanent. If you see it as impermanent, then the mind naturally will let go. It won't try to hold on. You'll see that there's nothing you can hold on to. And you'll recognize it's constantly changing. There's nothing you can hold on to. So it's just the nature of the body and mind, is that sometimes it produces pleasant sensations. That's all it is. It's just a sensation. It's not really important.
Yeah, I think it's crucial to watch the pleasant sensation. Like watch the process happen. Okay, there's a pleasant sensation. There's my wanting for more of it. Perhaps even the empty feeling when it's gone, like you're missing something. Yeah.
Impermanence, I want to say that Ayasada, Venerable Bhikkhuni from Cambodia here, approved, so she gave the thumbs up. She's a hardcore meditator. She's working on her English. When she's worked on her English, you can also come here. Otherwise, we'll do a Khmer live stream. She's very good teacher.
I understand inside and it. I cannot talk to English.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah, and also she understands experientially a lot too. And Nipunsara says, how can we relate to a samsaric journey of a person when we have to focus on non-self or anatta and not having Sakaya Ditti? Appreciate if you can please clarify. So I would say that this is actually related a little bit to what Nitan's question was. And I will quote actually Ajahn Pasanno, one of my favorite teachers and also Bhante Sutta's preceptor. He said I'll paraphrase because I don't remember exactly the quote. It's that the Buddha did not teach doctrine. The Buddha taught the way out of suffering. So how to relate to a samsaric journey of a person when we have to focus on non-self? It's not that like it's this, let me remember that sutta on that page. Wait, what does that mean? And let me rehearse it. And it's A, B, C, or let me impress my other Buddhist friends on how, very well versed I am in the Pali Canon or in the commentaries or in the commentaries of the commentaries or in the, whatever thing we can get into in the Abhidhamma, in the commentaries of the Abhidhamma. But rather is actually looking, what does, for example, non-self mean? Do we have an experience of there being a person there? Do we have an experience of self? Well, yeah, of course. Unless we have a stage of awakening, we definitely have a self. Yeah. There can't be a transcending of the self if we don't understand what that self is. So in order to know the self, to transcend the self, you need to understand what that self is. And essentially, the reason why there is no self is because the self, the current self that we have, is dependently arisen. And it's radically different, for example, of the self that I have right now and the self that was before I ordained, or the self that was before I started Buddhist practice, and the self that I had before moving to the United States, and the self I had before moving to the UK, and the self I had when I was only living in Italy, and the self I had when I was, a little child. And what made all these differences? All the different causes and conditions that were there. Right? So then we start depersonalizing it. And some are based on, nationality, some are based on age, some are based on gender, some are based on sex, some are based on race, some are based on so many different factors, right? And once we start doing that work on ourselves and start identifying how these traits that we think are who we are, they're like, oh, I am the shy person, or I am the insecure person, or I am the extrovert, or I like being behind the scenes, or I like being in front of the scenes, or I like whatever it is that we think. I'm creative, I'm not, I like numbers, I'm not scientific or whatever. Like, no, actually, all of these things have causes and conditions. They're not who I am. And in fact, they can change by putting different causes and conditions in place. That's why the cessation of suffering is possible. Essentially, right now we're dealing with a lot of consequences that are the product of causes that we put in place in the past. And there were a bunch of erratic things. Some things were wholesome, some things were unwholesome. So now we have this big jumbled mess. And now then we start making only wholesome choices. And then we realize that, yeah, we have a new sort of self that is actually generated by these wholesome causes and conditions that we put in place. And then once the work has been perfected, we throw it out all the way, and there's no self. So, yeah, that's what I have to say. But maybe the Venerables have something else to add. No?
That's good.
Can you please speak on right intention, Sangha? Well, I will be quiet. So maybe the two Venerables want to share.
Bhante, do you want to say anything?
Or maybe you can take this one and
Maybe, how about you assign?
Bhante, you can take right intention.
Okay. Yeah, so the standard definition that we find in the suttas for samma sankappa is so the attitude of harmlessness, the attitude of compassion, and the attitude of renunciation. So in Pali, my mind is blanking. So harmlessness, avihingsa, which is similar to the word ahimsa, so harmlessness, non-harming, non-cruelty. Oh, my mind is blanking. I actually don't remember the Pali off the top of my head. Do either of you remember the Pali term?
Avyapada sankapo.
Avyapada, yes, avyapada. So avyapada means hostility. So non-hostility. So non-hostility, non-harming, and then nekamma, which is usually translated as renunciation. So the first two are directly related to metta and karuna. So as I was talking about the last couple of days, this mind of loving kindness and compassion, of building up this genuine wish for everyone to be happy and healthy and safe. And that then forms the basis for how we act and what we do. So those are relatively straightforward. But the third one is actually by far the most important. So the attitude of renunciation, of nekamma. So this is not just something which is for monastics. It's actually something which is right at the core of all Buddhist practice. So Buddhist practice is about letting go of desire and aversion. It's letting go of the causes of suffering. It's about recognizing that attachment to anything is dukkha, and that therefore renunciation is happiness. It's sukha automatically. So so renunciation is the mind of non-attachment, the mind which doesn't require anything in order to be happy. So this is actually, it's pointing right at the heart of Buddhist practice. So I'm personally of the opinion that samma sankappa is one of the most important parts of the Noble Eightfold Path. Of course, now that I say that, if you ask me about any of the other 7 steps, I would say that it's one of the most important parts of the Eightfold Path. So don't take that too seriously.
Thank you, Bante. And Joseph asks, Venerable, what are some of the overlooked hindrances to entering jhana? I have been told that things like frequently listening to music can create obstacles.
Okay. I don't know if there's any overlooked hindrances. I mean, there's the 5, sensual desire, aversion, drowsiness, distraction, and doubt. And so what you're referring to is listening to music that would fall into the first hindrance. I mean, the state that you're trying to cultivate with jhana is it's bringing about this state of bliss and happiness and seclusion from any kind of sensuality or liking that is without. Yeah, I'm not sure of any overlooked hindrances.
Yeah, honestly, I think that ultimately it comes down to renunciation. As long as you're still seeking happiness in external things, then you won't be seeking happiness in samadhi. Your mind will always drift towards those external things when you're trying to meditate. So you mentioned the example of music. Well, that honestly, that's a really big problem. For the average layperson who's trying to enter samadhi, if you listen to music all the time, then that's going to make it really hard for you to get anywhere close to jhana. Or if you're always watching movies or playing games, then again, these are things that are going to make it very hard for you to get good samadhi. Not impossible, but it definitely will make it much harder for you. So it, as Venerable was saying, it contributes to sensual desire, but it also contributes to distraction and restlessness of mind. So agitation, which also is not helpful. It's the opposite of samadhi. Agitation is the opposite of samadhi.
Thank you, Venerables. And Rick asks, how do we skillfully interact with people who repeatedly lie, connive, and deceive, and who will not acknowledge the facts of truth? This could be politicians, co-workers, or family members. Well, you're probably not going to like this answer, but by practicing, by leading by example. Unfortunately, you cannot control other people, but you can control yourself. That's essentially what we're all empowered to do. And yeah, I mean, it's very difficult when you can't avoid people. So if you can't avoid any of all these people, well, first thing, if you can avoid someone, avoid them. Like if they're not, particularly skillful, avoid them. If they don't contribute to creating conditions for you to have wholesome mind states, then abstention is the number one thing to practice. And then if you can't, if you can't get away, if you can't abstain, then you have to endure. So you can see them as bodhisattvas that are teaching you patience. Very difficult. I know you're not going to like this answer at all. And yeah, also have compassion. Bodhisattvas that are teaching you compassion. In the past, you've also been someone who has lied, connived, and deceived others, and who has not acknowledged the facts of truth. Perhaps you're actually that person right now. I'm not saying you, Rick. But, that is something that is not just external. It's something that we've done to one degree or the other in this life, and to one degree or the other in previous lives. And if we don't put the right conditions in place, is, the behaviors that we're going to do in our next lives too. And by next life, I mean like tomorrow, actually, like right the second after this. So yeah, just worry about your mind. And actually, whenever you lead by example, that's when you actually inspire others to. You also show that there is a different way to to be in this world, different way to exist in this world, you know. Also the cat here, Stan, you know, he still lies and and kills people, kills sentient beings, not people, but
Well,
these,
small non-human people.
yeah, small non-human people. So he's not particularly, you know, the most virtuous sentient being. But he has become so much better since he has been, you know, living in monasteries, because I knew him before he was living in monasteries, before I had even a Buddhist practice. So there is something that actually we can teach that is universal, that it's unspoken even. Like he can't read Dhamma talks. He can't read, well, read in Dhamma talks or hear spoken Dhamma talks. He doesn't understand them. But he does understand metta. He does understand just sila, like being in a place where people are committed to wholesomeness. So he actually, for example, doesn't kill just for the sake of killing these days anymore, at least not that often. But he does kill and eat sometimes when he's outside or when creatures enter the monastery. But it has been reduced, yeah. And he's also very affectionate with everyone else. So yeah, don't underestimate what you can do. Yeah, please.
I think that one of the better ways is to skillfully interact with these kinds of people is just, as I pointed at, is just standing as the antithesis of them. Be the person who tells the truth, who's not deceitful, and also recognize that we still have, unless you're an arahant or an enlightened being, that we still have these proclivities within ourselves, that we're not so far off lying and deceiving people. I mean, how much would it take for someone to go down that path? And this kind of takes away the judgment that we can have for politicians and such.
Great, thank you, Venerable. And Dave says, hello, Bantis. Do you feel that excitement is violent? One might feel excitement is pleasurable, yet adrenaline seems to be present, both excitement and stress.
We were talking about this earlier, someone who picked me up.
Do you want to share what your conversation was about?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't particularly about excitement, but that Ajahn Jayasara said that our bodies are just not capable of withstanding great levels of pleasure. And you can feel it with the excitement that it rattles off the body. It's grainy, it's coarse. It can create tension. And so when you look at all three feelings, no one likes painful feeling. Neutral feeling is boring, and then you can see how even pleasurable feeling can at times be uncomfortable. When you've laughed for 20 minutes with your friends, it's you can feel the tension on your mouth, or it can be uncomfortable at times. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Sam asks, Venerable, what Sakaliko Dhamma actually means? Is it referring to here and now, or Dhamma is true in the past, now, and future, therefore timeless?
So Sutta is about this.
Actually, both of your interpretations that you've given are true. So akaliko, its literal meaning is simply not connected with time. It's not related to time. It doesn't possess time, or it doesn't have time as a factor. So both of the explanations you give are actually accurate. So the Dhamma is here and now. It is immediate. Well, it's one way you can understand akaliko. It means it's immediate. It's something that's right here in the present moment. But also not dependent on time means that it is just as applicable in the past, in the present, and in the future. So the Dhamma is timeless in the sense that it's a timeless truth. It was true since the beginning of time, which there was no beginning, and it's true now, and it will continue to be true for all eternity. So that's ultimately what it means. Time is not a factor in the relevance of the Dhamma.
It's not exactly an answer to your question, but I find it somewhat related that, when we talk about the three characteristics of existence, it's a rather bold claim that this is how the universe is. This is describing how nature is, and so it's only a matter of time for someone wakes up to that. In our case, it was this Indian man 2,500 years ago, and thus it's only natural that Buddhas will arise in the world to these truths. And I think that also pays into the timelessness of the Dhamma.
Right, thank you, Venerables. And yeah, David.
So in the suttas, sometimes we'll talk about like the eye and forms and the ear and the sounds. How are the eye and the ear and the other senses different from the body? Does it mean like the physical eyeball, something in the ear hole, or does it mean something more subtle?
I think you're overthinking it. Yeah, don't think about it too much. And if you want to get into Abhidhamma, then the Abhidhamma goes into exploring this topic of exactly how does the mind interact with physical phenomena. But that seems to just be the speculation of later monks. So I wouldn't take it too seriously. So what is meant by the eye? Well, I mean, I think often the Buddha, he was just talking in perfectly ordinary ways. He was like, when you have eyes and there's something to see, then you experience seeing. So it's talking in an ordinary, relatable way that people can understand. But fundamentally, what we're talking about is a mental process of generating a self-centered experience of a world. That's what's being talked about here. So there's this sense of this is me over here, and it's seeing that stuff out there, which is other than me. So that's really what's going on, is that we're using the experience of the six senses as a way of building up our self-identity, a way of shoring up our sense of I, me, and mine. And the Buddha gave the six senses as one way of analyzing the different ways that we construct and maintain self-identity. But I wouldn't get too literalist about it, because if we start getting literalist about it, then we're missing the underlying point. Fundamentally, reality is cannot be discriminated into separate objects. Fundamentally, one way of talking is that fundamentally there are no sankharas. But we generate sankharas because of our own delusion. Because of the delusion of self-existence, then we generate the sankharas of eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And we generate the sankharas of sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought. And we generate the sankharas of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and thinking. But all of that is just the product of our delusion of self-existence, delusion of self-identity. Because of our delusion of self-existence, then we start fragmenting reality into different pieces that we can relate to in terms of me and not me. But when one drops that delusion of self-existence, then all of that fragmentation ceases immediately. So all that concept of eyes and ears and nose and tongue and body and mind becomes irrelevant. So like in the famous Mahayana text, the Heart Sutra, it says, in emptiness there is no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind. Well, that's talking about nibbana. It's talking about the asankata dhatu, the unconditioned element. It's talking about how when we relinquish self-identity, then also the separation between eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind becomes irrelevant. We recognize that that was all a mental fabrication, which was built up out of our self-attachment. None of it was objectively real. It's all just a fabrication of our own delusions. This is one way of talking about it anyway. Yeah.
Hayden asks, is there a risk that learning Pali could be an opportunity to build up ego? I feel like that is a danger for me. Well, that's related to what Venerable was talking about earlier. So essentially, what is your intention? So yeah, if your intention is to impress people, then yes, then don't do it. But if your intention, actually, I think someone else earlier in the comments said something about getting closer to the meaning of the words. So that is actually quite wholesome, because that underlies an intention of wanting to understand better the Dhamma. That has been my experience, actually, in learning Pali and translating from Pali to English and from Pali to Italian, is actually having a better understanding of the Dhamma, which then can once again be used experientially. So for my practice, not for something that has any other purpose except for leading towards the cessation of suffering. Kita says, Bhante Sudhaso, so this is clearly you. Can you please speak a bit about Animitta Samadhi and how can one use this to break through to the second link, karmic formations, and the 12 links of dependent origination?
Well, as I was saying just now, in practicing Animitta Samadhi, fundamentally what you're doing is you're letting go of all sankharas. So you're dropping all nimittas, dropping all objects, discrete phenomena. Means that you're no longer generating any sankharas. Since you're not generating any sankharas, well, that cuts the chain right there. So then all that's left is the underlying avijja, the underlying ignorance, the underlying delusion. But when you've cut everything else, then avijja is all that's left to look at. So it should be much easier to spot when it's not obscured by all those sankharas.
Thank you, Bhante. And Suts asks, how does one make sure one definitely is going to have a good rebirth in the future? The reason why I laugh for Suts is because sometimes people spell Bhante Sudhasa's name as Bhante Suds. Oh. So it makes me smile to read Suds, but I assume you're not a Bhante.
Well, it actually came because somebody had copy-pasted my name into a non-Unicode font. So the part of my name that has diacritics was just deleted when it was put in the non-Unicode font. So then it left with Suds.
Yeah. And anyway, so your question is, how does one make sure one definitely is going to have a good rebirth in the future? You know.
I mean,
come on, this is Buddhism 101. You've got this one.
Well, undertaking the 5 precepts is a good place to start. But there's no guarantee, unfortunately. There's that one sutta, I forget, Anguttara Nikaya somewhere, and this woman comes to the Buddha, and she's like, why is it, I think it was her uncle, why is my uncle, who's a drunkard and doesn't follow the precepts, why was he reborn in heaven? But my father, he was a good person, he was reborn in hell. With the idea of many rebirths, that we've been living countless lives. It's not just what you've done in this life, but what people have done in previous lives that will determine, the course of rebirths. But just taking this life, I'd say, undertake the 5 precepts, cultivate wholesome speech, cultivate good actions, guard the mind, and then you have a good chance.
Okay, thank you. And Dave says, how do you relate to those of the Christian faith? There seems to be similarities outside the belief in an omniscient being. I think we relate fine. Yeah, there are actually a lot of renowned Christian monks that practice Buddhist meditation. Actually, 4 years ago it was, Bhante, that we went to Italy and we visited some monasteries there. Yeah, this monastery called Eremo di Camaldoli, which is like about 1,000 years old. They offer retreats on meditation, Buddhist meditation. And yoga, actually, also they use both, led by monastics, like Christian monastics, Catholic monastics, actually, to be quite specific. So it was interesting, because, yeah, I mean, Buddhism, for the most part, not entirely, but you don't have to be Buddhist to practice Buddhist meditation, for example. And actually, a lot of the ways that, actually, we have this saying in Italian that I think is perfect, it's just genius, that is not related to Buddhism, but I use it in a Buddhist context, that goes, help yourself that God will help you. That's the translation. Aiutati che Dio ti aiuta. So help yourself that God will help you. So Buddhism essentially takes care of the help yourself part, and then Christianity takes care of God will help you. So a lot of people, and we've had it actually through the history of our organization, would come from the Christian faith background or the Muslim faith background or Jewish background, and they practice Buddhism no problem. And actually it makes them better Christian, better Muslims, better whatever they are, better atheists, better agnostics, whatever they're doing. So it's always wholesome. It's very useful. You know, sometimes there's things in Christianity like love your neighbor like yourself, which is very much something that is in accordance with Dhamma, something that should be done, but it's very difficult to love your neighbor, you know, if your neighbor is arrogant and greedy and irritable and yells at you every morning, etc. So how do you do that? Well, Buddhism offers a lot of different techniques, skills to generate that mind of loving kindness. So that's why it's easily incorporated in other traditions. So there are similarities, but there are also different things. So then, you know, it really depends on the individual. I'm, how do you say? I'm monogamous, so I'm only Buddhist. But other people like to practice different religions. Yeah, Mr. Orange says, I think we need to be accepting to all religions and respect others. Yeah, that's a very good idea. And Mr. Orange also says, general religion will be based on where you were born and lived. That isn't much of a choice. Well, I think here you have three choices, actually. None of us were born Buddhist, unless Venerable Adamika was born Buddhist and I'm not aware of. Okay, great. No. So, yeah, it's not necessarily the case these days anymore. And we have another question for Bhante Sutaso. Is it true that pre-sectarian Buddhism does not reject Atma, also taking consciousness as the fundamental ground of being via neti?
No, that's utterly, completely wrong. Yeah, I don't know where you heard that. That sounds more like Advaita Vedanta Hinduism. That doesn't sound at all like Buddhism. So there is a particular branch of Hinduism, Advaita Vedanta, which has very strong similarities to Buddhism. And it arose in northern India several hundred years after Buddhism. And one of the running theories in Buddhist circles, of course, not in Hindu circles, one of the running theories in Buddhist circles is that Advaita Vedanta was an attempt to merge Buddhism and Hinduism. And of course, the critical core divide between Buddhism and Hinduism is the concept of anatta or anatman in Buddhism versus the concept of atta or atman in Hinduism. So Advaita Vedanta wound up allying itself with the Hindu side of things and taking a stance that there is in fact a true self, an eternal soul. But Buddhism is very clear that there is no such thing. It cannot be found. Nothing whatsoever can be found which is permanent, stable, and which can be truly identified as an individual, ongoing being or entity. So yeah, I don't know where you heard that, but it's definitely wrong.
Okay, thank you, Bante. And Rick asks, I do my best to keep an open and loving heart. Very good, thumbs up. But I regularly experience prejudice, rejection, and hostility from others if they become aware of my Buddhist practice. Do you have any guidance of how to live in a community that has such contempt?
Okay, so it sounds like it's not just a random person finding about your practice, but people you're actually living with, your family. It's not too specific.
Maybe a town, neighborhood, etc.
Co-workers, maybe.
Co-workers, everybody. Everybody.
Everybody hates my practice. Yeah. In certain contexts, I would just say if they're overly critical, abandon them. Find new friends or a new place to work. I'm not sure. Anybody have some advice for our friend?
Just do it. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult actually. I can imagine, especially if it's your family. My family is not particularly supportive of my practice, definitely not in this form. So they can be quite critical and judgmental and etc. But they live in a different continent, so perhaps it's a little bit easier for me to say, just do your thing and endure. Might be a little bit more challenging if it's a day-to-day basis situation. But it's also true that the more you practice, the more you become a better person, and the more the people who are criticizing can't deny the fact that you're becoming a better person. So why would they want you to do something else if that is actually what creates a better person? So even my parents, who are not particularly happy that I wear robes and decided not to handle money and not to have property and not to have family and work and whatever. I work a lot, so it's kind of like but anyway, all of such things, they just become more acceptant of the thing, of my choices, and I think actually happier to see me happier anyway. So just do it. Maybe Bhante Subazo, you have other suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that really hits on it, is just stay confident in the rightness of your path. And if other people have negativity towards it, well, that's their own problem. Your practice is not to be bothered by their negativity. And they might come around eventually, or they might not. But either way, it doesn't matter because you're dedicated to your Buddhist practice.
Oh, Rick actually gives more information that it's based on strict religious beliefs. So I live in a rural area of the USA that is openly hostile to anything that is not the one true religion.
Move.
Yep.
Yeah, that's your only option. Move. There's no convincing people like that. It's hopeless.
The two Americans know better.
No, I mean, I grew up in this country. I know what those people are like. In fact, that describes half my family.
That's why there's no Buddhist monasteries in the South, really. Bhante G, his monastery in West Virginia, he was shot at. That's not what you came here to hear, but I think.
But by actually continuing to practice, then he has created a lot of change around him. So actually, thank you for mentioning Bhante G, because it's very inspiring. People were very hostile, and on top of that, he was not even American. So he was weird on so many different levels, not only for the religion, when you're a foreigner, when you're an immigrant, you're just weird by default. I mean, I'm weird. I was weird even before I became a monastic. You're just not really understanding. I offend, even as a monastic, I offend half of the American population all the time. I just say improper things all the time. So I apologize if you just arrived. I probably offended you multiple times. So it's it's really inspiring, actually, the story of Bhante, because he opened his monastery in West Virginia, where the majority of the people that surround the monastery are hunters. So I still remember when I went actually to the retreat there the first time as a lay person, that their neighbors had a sign that says, with a heart, actually, it has a big heart on it, and it says, trespass and you will be a moving target.
Wow.
We love guns. That's how it was. We love guns. Trespass and you will be a moving target. And I was like, wait, there's a heart. They were telling me and they were gonna shoot me, you know. I'm like, whoa, this is so bizarre. And I was also kind of relatively new to the United States, and in Europe we don't really have guns like as civilians. So there was a lot of like confusion in my mind. But yeah, Bhante actually was there at a time where they had no heart on the side, and they were outright hostile with even the idea that there was, like, you know, a Buddhist monastery there, let alone a Buddhist monastery led by someone who didn't look like the people there, and didn't even, you know, have the same culture or ate the same food and whatnot. But just by practicing, he inspired so many. Actually, Bhante Sudaso has lived in that monastery for quite some time, so you maybe have some stories. Also, the families would come and to the monastery too.
Just took years. It took years, but yeah, slowly, people do start to come around. If you practice compassion and patience, then yeah, over a long period of many years, then the people around you can start to accept you.
There's a sutta that comes to mind right now. I forget the monk that it's talking about, but he's living in this area where the people there are very hostile. And so this monk comes to visit the Buddha, and the Buddha's like, "Oh, how are you living?" Well, Lord Buddha, they're very difficult to live there. How does it go?
Well, the Buddha's like, "Well, what will you do if they speak rudely to you?"
Yeah.
And the monk says, "Then I will think, oh, these people are so lovely. It's so nice that they don't punch me." And the Buddha's like, "Well, what do you do if they punch you?" And he's like, "Oh, these people, they're so friendly. They're so nice that they don't stab me." And the Buddha's like, "Well, what do you do if they stab you?" And he's like, "Oh, these lovely people, they're so kind that they're not killing me." And the Buddha's like, "Well, what are you going to do if they kill you?" And he's like, "Oh, how lovely. These people are trying to deprive me of suffering." And the Buddha's like, "Okay, yeah, you can keep living there. You've got the right attitude."
So you can ask yourself these questions and see if you're ready to keep living there. All right, and then Sud also has another question. How does one take intellectual understanding of Dhamma and turn it into experience? For example, it's as if engaging in sensual pleasures is like smoking. You know, it's not right, but it pulls you. As a former smoker, I feel like I can relate to this simile. So I would say, first of all, the Buddha invites us to contemplate in every single moment, actually, in every single thing that we are experiencing, the gratification, the danger, and the escape. So if there wasn't any gratification in samsara, we're not idiots, you know, we wouldn't engage in it. You know, if pizza is not good, we don't eat pizza, no? Like, very easy. So there is a gratification there. The problem is that we only focus on the gratification, but we don't see the danger. So, for example, that it's impermanent. How many pizzas have I had in my life? And I'm not talking about American pizza. I love you all Americans, but you know, it's a different thing, the Italian pizza. So I've had the real deal so many times, delicious, perfect, cooked to the, you know, with the right ingredients, right from the farm to table, the right temperature, with the person that has been doing this for generations and generations. And has it ever made me fully satisfied? Not really, because right now, you know, there's still that craving for pizza, right? Like, there's always, you just keep on wanting it. It never fulfills you. So contemplating the impermanent, impermanence of it is absolutely essential. The unsatisfactoriness. And then understanding that there is a way out of it. So instead of like, okay, I have pizza, that is the gratification. Then there is no pizza and I still want happiness. So then that means I need another pizza. Instead, we actually contemplate this reflection. Actually, Bhante Sudaso invited me to have a few years ago that really made an impact, is that we think that when we actually have the pizza, if we want the pizza, then we get the pizza and we're like, oh yes, now finally I'm happy. So we think that the pizza made us happy. But in reality, is when we get the pizza for that moment, we actually relinquish the desire. So why not skip the whole suffering of craving the pizza and wanting the pizza and like going out of your way to find the right pizza and the right pizza place, and now it's closed. Oh, now they changed the recipe. Oh, now it's a different owner. Oh, now I moved it to a different neighborhood. Oh, now it changed the time. So you can't eat it anymore at the time that you were used to, like all of that dukkha. Just relinquish the desire altogether and you're happy whether you have it or not. So you can do it with smoking too. And also, actually, as I was explaining earlier, also look at the really not that pleasant side of smoking altogether. Appetite comes with eating. This does not, the Buddha doesn't say that, but Italian sayings say that. So appetite comes with eating. It means the more you do something, the more you crave it. And it's very true. So the more you smoke, the more you're like, this is pretty great. Then you stop smoking for a while, you pick up the cigarette, and you're like, it's great, but it's also disgusting. I mean, like, I have like, yeah. Ugh. So you start having a fuller, more objective experience. So take breaks and let go and renunciation. Essentially, JOMO, as we like to say here, the joy of missing out.
JOMO.
Instead of FOMO. And Sud also says, I don't smoke, but was saying the terrible addiction of sensual pleasures is like smoking. Well, maybe I spoke too much, so you can add your considerations and thoughts.
No, I think you pinned on it. And I would say also this is why there is the practice of periodic renunciation in Buddhism. So where people will take the 8 precepts once a month or twice a month. So you get a temporary experience of what it's like to practice renunciation for a day. Or going and staying in a monastery for a week or a month. So again, you get this temporary experience. And once you take a little break from the addictive cycle, then sometimes that's enough to break you out of it. And you get that clear vision of how it's painful. It's not exclusively pleasant.
It's also good to remember, and there's one sutta that corroborates this. From a neurological perspective, most of your pleasure comes about from just craving for the object, and you don't really derive much pleasure from having the object. And there's a sutta that says, sensual pleasure is not, the object's. It's not the object itself, but sensual intention is sensual pleasure. That's not verbatim, but it paints the same picture.
Great, thank you, Venerable. That was the last question from the online audience. Is there any other reflections or thoughts?
You gave a series of talks about like Dhamma for householders, and there was one topic around livelihood that I was trying to read more in, and the suttas aren't very clear on like what right livelihood means in terms of, it's pretty straightforward. Right livelihood is like, not wrong livelihood. And I, as somebody in the modern world, I'm struggling with that. So I don't know if there's anything more about wrong livelihood or right livelihood that we can go into.
There's something about that, especially in Anguttara Nikaya. It talks about like not being a butcher, for example, not you can say not being in the military, not being a bartender, something like that. Things that where you're servicing people. I don't know, when you're killing things, when you're lying. So being in the CIA, it's not a good way to go.
Basically, any occupation which harms sentient beings is wrong livelihood. Any occupation which encourages sentient beings to break precepts is wrong livelihood. So optimally, right livelihood, in a perfect world, it's something which benefits sentient beings without causing harm. But at a bare minimum, something which is harmless, which doesn't harm sentient beings. So that actually leaves a tremendous number of options. But it does rule out a number of things.
Non-harm is a tricky line to figure out, because if you really dig into something, even in the livelihood, it feels like you're always harming in some way. You know, if I'm out there in a capitalist society and I'm charging rent, or I'm, you know, providing housing in exchange for money, right? There can be harm on it, and every day there can be harm in a normal job that, you know, isn't killing. It's, you know, it's a normal job. So how do we navigate those micro harms that maybe come out of work?
So then your intention is harm reduction. So constantly try to minimize and reduce the amount of harm that you cause, and try to maximize the amount of benefit that you cause. So it is difficult. Living in samsara, it's difficult to be 100% harmless, but we try. We make that our aspiration and we move in that direction. So harm reduction it's not a goal, it's a process. So we commit to the process of gradually reducing the amount of harm that we cause. And maybe we should go ahead and end at that point. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts? We have 3 minutes. Kan jag börja, Mika? You have something to add.
Oh, 2 minutes.
All right, maybe not. All right, so we can end then with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
And if you're around the monastery Empty Cloud in New Jersey on Sunday, there will be a Katina ceremony here. So you're welcome all to join in. We won't broadcast it, I don't believe, unless some volunteer decides to do something like that. If you are not around in person, we'll see you online again next Wednesday. Next week, every Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, 8 a.m. and 7:30 p.m. New York City time. All right. May you all be well and happy, and may all good things come to you.